There's a detail in the very first scene of The Walking Dead that I've never been able to shake. In Days Gone By, Rick Grimes is walking through a wrecked gas station. He hasn't spoken yet. The world hasn't explained itself yet. And then he hears something, and he follows it. And he crouches down beside an abandoned car. And there, in the rubble, are a pair of pink bunny slippers. Small feet, a child's blanket. And the thing wearing them turns, and Rick sees it, and the camera stays on his face. He can't do it yet. He can't fire. He stands in the pause between knowing and doing. And then the shot comes, and the world begins. I keep coming back to that pause, because I think that moment, that specific aching silence, is the whole show. And tonight, I want to find out why. Let's stay in that gas station for a while. Before the shot, before the walkers, before Alexandria, before the saviors, before any of the wars and the walls and the losses the show will spend 11 seasons cataloguing. Let's stay in the quiet. Frank Darabont, who directed and wrote the pilot episode, opens Days Gone By without dialogue for what feels like a very long time. Rick moves through a wrecked landscape. He finds a jerry can. He's looking for gas. It's a practical thing, a survival thing. And the camera watches him do it with no narration, no exposition, no helpful text on screen to orient us. We are dropped into this world the same way Rick is dropped into it. Alone, confused, reading the wreckage for clues, trying to understand the shape of what happened from the evidence it left behind. That choice, to open in silence, to trust image over explanation, is a specific and difficult craft decision. It asks the audience to do something that most television doesn't ask, to look and to feel before being told what to think. The ruins speak. The emptiness speaks. The small sneakers near the abandoned car speak. And then the little girl turns, and we understand in our bodies, before we understand in our minds, exactly what kind of world this is. We know it the way Rick knows it. Not through information, but through encounter. The pause before the shot is our motif for tonight. It's the space between the moment Rick recognizes what he's looking at and the moment he acts. And in that space, that breath, that hesitation, that stillness, is everything The Walking Dead has ever been about. Love and necessity. The before and the after. The person you were before you knew what the world could ask of you, and the person you became once you did. What Darabont understood, and what the pilot demonstrates with extraordinary confidence, is that the emotional grammar of a survival story is established before the first crisis. It's established in texture, in how long the camera holds a face, in how much room the silence gets, in what the first shot is of, and what the second is, and what happens when the two are held in relation. The gas station sequence, Rick crouching, looking, pausing, firing, is a lesson in that grammar. The show tells you, before anything else happens, this is how we're going to do this. This is the weight we're going to carry. This is the kind of story you're in. And here's the thing that stays with me. Was that silence a choice the show could only make once? Not because the craft wasn't there afterward. The show would have beautiful moments again. Episodes that knew how to be quiet. But because silence at the beginning of a story carries a different weight than silence in the middle. At the beginning, the silence is full of everything we don't yet know. Every frame is a question. Later, the silence is full of what we already know. And that's meaningful too, but differently. The gas station works the way it works, because the world is new. Because we are new to it. The pause before the shot. That's where we start. And I think if we follow it all the way through 11 seasons, through the spin-offs, through everything the franchise tried to say after that first morning, we're going to find that it never fully left. It just moved into different bodies, different windows, different silences. And that's what tonight is really about. Rick Grimes on horseback, riding into Atlanta. If you've seen it, you remember it. If you're seeing it for the first time, go find it. It's one of the great images in television history, and I don't say that lightly. A lone figure on a horse, moving through a highway that should be full of cars and noise and ordinary human life, entering a city that should be full of millions of people. The aerial shot opens up. The skyscrapers, the empty streets, the morning light across Georgia. And for a moment, before the walkers, before the herd, before the tank, there is just the beauty of the space that human absence creates. It's a terrible beauty, the kind that catches in your throat because you understand what you're looking at. A city that was full of people and isn't anymore. The scale of the grief is too large to hold directly. So the show holds it through the image, through the visual fact of emptiness that would have been fullness. You fill in the missing people yourself. That's the camera's instruction. Feel this. And you do. Darabont came to The Walking Dead from a specific cinematic tradition. He had directed The Shawshank Redemption and The Mist. Films that understood how space and silence carry emotional weight. How the quality of light in a corridor, or the sound of wind through a destroyed building, can do more narrative work than pages of dialogue. That sensibility is all over the pilot. The tank sequence, where Rick crawls inside to escape the herd and finds a dead soldier, is filmed with claustrophobic patience. The camera staying close. The sound design precise. Every detail earning its place. The herd photography, which required extraordinary coordination for a television pilot in 2010, has a kind of terrible grandeur. The mass of moving bodies, the sound, the specific horror of scale. And then the radio. Rick sealed in the tank, realizing he's trapped. He picks up a radio that shouldn't be working, in a situation that seems to have no exit, in a city full of things that used to be people. And a voice comes through, a young man's voice. Practical, a little exasperated, with a joke underneath the urgency. Hey, you, dumbass. Glenn Rhee's introduction to the story is a voice through static. A lifeline that sounds like a wisecrack. And it is the single most perfect piece of character economy in the entire series. We will spend seasons learning to love Glenn Rhee, and everything worth knowing about him is in that one radio transmission. Here's what I want to sit with, though. The subsequent seasons of The Walking Dead had more resources than the pilot. Bigger budgets, more locations, more production capacity, and they produced some spectacular sequences. The prison battle, the Alexandria Wolf attack, the Whisperer Wars horrors, but the aerial shot of Rick in Atlanta, the tank, Glenn's voice on the radio, those have stayed in the cultural memory in a way that most of what followed, however well executed, did not. Why? I think it's partly the condition of newness. The first time you see a thing, it registers differently than the second. But I also think it's the specific quality of ambition that the pilot carries. Not the ambition of scale exactly. Later seasons were bigger in almost every measurable way. But the ambition of trying to make you feel something that hasn't been named yet. The pilot isn't explaining an apocalypse to you. It's showing you one. And the difference between those two modes of storytelling is exactly the difference between watching it and being inside it. Can a show ever recapture the feeling of the audience seeing the apocalypse for the very first time? Some fans argue that Fear the Walking Dead's first season came closest, for different reasons, and we'll get to that. Others think the pilot's specific power is entirely unrepeatable, that it's the product of a moment, a director, a cast who didn't yet know what they were doing, and let that not knowing show. Both of those readings feel true to me, and both of them point to the same quiet question. What did the show lose when the world became familiar? And is the franchise still, all these years later, searching for a way back to that first morning? The most important moment in The Walking Dead's pilot doesn't involve Rick. It happens in a house in a suburb outside Atlanta. Upstairs, in a darkened room, in a terrible quiet, Morgan Jones sits at a window with a rifle. Through the scope, in the street below, he can see his wife. She was Jenny before all of this. She is something else now. She walks past the house in the pattern of the turned, without purpose, without recognition, with only the specific kind of movement that means the before is entirely gone. And Morgan watches her. Every day, he watches her. He has the rifle, he has the scope, and he cannot fire. Rick finds Morgan and his son Dwayne hiding in a neighbor's house during the first episode. And the scene where Morgan explains what happened to Rick, to himself, to no one who can help him with it, is the emotional center of the pilot. Not the herd, not the tank, not Glenn's radio voice. This. A man who loves his wife so completely that the love itself has become the obstacle. The world requires him to do the thing love will not allow. And so he sits at the window every day and watches her pass and cannot close the gap between knowing and doing. The sight line through the window is our second motif, running alongside the silence before the shot. They are the same thing. Really, the pause made spatial. The hesitation given a frame. Morgan's window is what the gas station sequence looks like when you slow it down to its essence and stretch it across years. Rick had only a moment of pause before he fired. Morgan has been living inside that moment for however long it's been since the world ended. What's extraordinary about the pilot's choice to center this scene? To let it breathe. To let Lenny James give Morgan's grief the full room it needs. Is that it establishes the show's thematic architecture before the first season has even begun. This is what The Walking Dead is about. Not the walkers, not the survival, not the strategy, or the community building, or the wars. It's about the cost of love in a world that punishes tenderness. It's about what happens when the most human thing you have becomes the most dangerous thing you carry. Morgan's rifle. In the scope's crosshairs, his wife's face. That image is the show in miniature. Everything that follows is, in some way, a variation on it. And the variation the show chooses to return to is significant. In Season 3's Clear, one of the most acclaimed and contained episodes in the entire run, we find Morgan again, years later. He went back to the house. Eventually. He eventually fired the shot he couldn't fire in Season 1. His son Dwayne was gone by then, bitten by Jenny, the very wife Morgan couldn't end. The delay cost everything. The love that made him pause, that kept him from doing the thing the world required, ultimately destroyed the very things the love was trying to protect. Clear is the pilot's thesis returned to in a different key. Morgan, alone now, in a town of his own devising. Traps everywhere, writing on the walls. A kind of order from chaos that grief builds when it runs out of other directions. Rick finds him there, and it's one of the quietest reunions in the series. No speeches. Just two men who went different directions from the same starting point, standing in the rubble of what choosing different directions cost them. Morgan can't pull the trigger in episode 1. That's a fact. And the ripple of that hesitation, the shape it makes in the seasons that follow, in Morgan's arc, in the franchise's returning gaze toward the original wound, is one of the most sustained narrative consequences the show ever committed to. What would have been different if he had fired? That's the question the pilot plants and the franchise keeps excavating. Because the answer isn't simple, and the show knows it. Firing would have cost him something too. Not firing cost him something different. In this world, the pause and the shot both have a price. The only question is which invoice you can live with. And that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least, it might. Frank Darabont brought something to The Walking Dead's pilot that the show would spend years trying to hold on to and find increasingly difficult to replicate consistently. Not budget. The show's budget grew substantially after its premiere success. Not cast. The ensemble deepened and expanded across the seasons. What Darabont brought was a specific commitment to the unhurried image, to the frame that doesn't explain itself, to the storytelling principle that the most important things a survival story has to say should be felt before they're understood. He directed and wrote Days Gone By with the sensibility of a filmmaker working in a director's medium, not a showrunner managing a production. Every shot in the pilot has the quality of a deliberate choice, the kind where you sense someone asked, for each frame, what is this image doing? And refused to include it if the answer was only moving the plot forward. The tank interior, where Rick finds the dead soldier's grenade, is filmed with a claustrophobia that makes your chest tighten. The herd, photographed from above and then from inside, has a scale that the show achieved at that level only rarely afterward. The gas station, the hospital corridors, the suburb where Morgan lives, each location is given space to be itself, to carry its own texture, before the story starts using it. What happened after Darabont left the show? He departed during season 2 production, under circumstances that were public and complicated, is one of The Walking Dead's most discussed behind-the-scenes realities. The show continued, successfully, through many subsequent showrunners and creative teams. It produced some genuinely exceptional television, but the pilot's specific sustained quality, the patience, the frame-by-frame commitment to felt rather than explained storytelling, is something the show touched in isolated moments rather than maintained as a continuous standard. Season premieres often attempted the cinematic. The Season 4 premiere's prison garden opening. The Season 5 premiere's terminus sequence. The Season 9 premiere's time jump reveal. These are well-crafted moments, but they operate differently from the pilot. They are delivering information inside a visual style, whereas the pilot was building an emotional language before it had anything to deliver. The distinction sounds small. In practice, it determines how a viewer's body responds to what they're watching, whether they're inside the experience or observing it. The herd photography in the pilot involved real coordination challenges for a television production in 2010, the scale of what Darabont attempted, and the fact that it worked, viscerally, on a first viewing, and still holds up, suggests a creative ambition that the show was sometimes able to match, and often found it difficult to sustain. Not because the talent wasn't there, but because sustained ambition of that specific kind requires more than talent. It requires the creative conditions to prioritize the difficult choice over the efficient one, episode after episode, season after season. And that's genuinely hard to maintain in long-running television production. The pattern that emerges when you look at the seasons holistically, and this is my read, not an official statement from anyone involved in making the show, is that the pilot set a standard that functioned as an aspiration rather than a baseline. The show reached toward it in its best episodes and landed at something competent and sometimes excellent in between. But the baseline shifted over time, away from the pilot's specific discipline, toward a mode of storytelling that was efficient and effective, and occasionally spectacular, without consistently carrying that quality of felt before understood. When Darabont left, did the show lose something it never named? I think it might have lost the answer to a question the pilot made implicit. Whose job is it to ask, "What is this image doing?" for every frame? When the person who asked that question most consistently was no longer in the room, the asking became more occasional, and you can see the difference if you rewatch the pilot after the later seasons. Not because the later seasons are bad. Many episodes across the run are genuinely great, but because the pilot has a continuous quality that feels specific to a single vision held in focus without interruption. And that kind of consistency is very hard to get back once the conditions that created it have changed. Rick Grimes is still wearing his uniform when the world ends for him. That's the detail I keep returning to when I think about what the pilot does that the later seasons couldn't do the same way. Rick arrives in the apocalypse, still dressed as the person he was before it. The khaki shirt, the badge, the holster with the Colt Python, his service weapon, the gun that will become the show's most recurring symbolic object across 8 seasons. He wakes up in the hospital. He walks into the ruins. He puts on his uniform reflexively, the way you do when you don't know yet that the context for that uniform is gone. There's a specific kind of grief in that image that the pilot understands and uses carefully. Rick in uniform isn't just a visual shorthand for "this person is law enforcement." It's the picture of someone still inside the before, still operating from the belief that the systems the uniform represents are functional, that the authority the badge confers is real, that the Colt Python on his hip makes him something other than just a man in a dangerous world. He's wearing the framework of the old world as armor against the new one, and the pilot lets him wear it without immediately punishing him for it, because the dignity of that choice, the effort of trying to bring what you were into what you're becoming, is worth honoring. The tension that generates every season of The Walking Dead follows from this. Rick's belief in the frameworks of the old world, law, order, legitimate authority. The idea that strength should be accountable to something larger than itself is what makes him a leader worth following. It's also what makes him dangerous, repeatedly, to the communities around him, because the old world's frameworks don't translate cleanly into a world where legitimacy has to be rebuilt from nothing, and where the authority the badge represents belongs to anyone willing to pick up what the badge stood for and carry it forward, with or without the badge itself. Every Rick has to accept the New World arc across the series is, in my read, a restatement of what the pilot established in its first act. He is the last policeman, not the last good person. The show is full of those, or people trying to be, but the last person genuinely operating as if the old structures still obtain. That quality makes him both the group's most consistent anchor and, periodically, its most significant liability. When the situation requires someone who can act within a framework, Rick is indispensable. When the situation requires someone who can abandon the framework entirely, Rick hesitates, or acts, but at a cost that takes seasons to fully reckon with. The Colt Python travels with him everywhere. It's a striking visual choice. The gun is distinctive, identifiable, not the kind of weapon that blends into the background of post-apocalyptic firearms. It marks Rick as Rick. It connects each season's version of him back to the uniform he was wearing when the world ended. Even when he's covered in road dust, even when he's been through things that have changed him almost beyond recognition, the Python says, "This is still the last policeman." This is still the person who woke up in that hospital and reached for his service weapon. Because that's what you do when you're law enforcement, and something is wrong. And then, eventually, he doesn't have it anymore. The season 9 bridge explosion takes Rick out of the story, and the python goes with him. And what remains in Alexandria is Judith, his daughter, eventually carrying it forward. A child with her father's gun and her mother's sword. The symbols of two different models of survival, held in small hands. If the pilot is the last time Rick truly believes in the old rules, is every episode afterward a kind of mourning? I think the answer might be yes. Not grief that incapacitates. Rick is nothing if not functional. But the specific low-level grief of someone who knows the thing they believe in doesn't quite fit the world they're living in, and keeps trying to make it fit anyway. The uniform becomes a habit. The habit becomes a stance. And the stance is both what saves people and what costs them, again and again, until the bridge. Hey you, dumbass. That's Glenn Rhee's first line of dialogue in The Walking Dead. Rick is in the tank, surrounded by walkers, with no visible exit, and a grenade that the dead soldier left behind as a last resort. The radio crackles, and Glenn's voice comes through, practical, a little amused, gently urgent, with the rhythm of someone who finds the situation serious, but not quite as dire as Rick currently believes. You're surrounded by walkers, a whole herd of them, he continues in the season 1 episode. I don't know how many for sure, but I know you want to get out of that tank. I'd want to get out of there too if I were you. The voice before the face. The connection before the community. Glenn Rhee enters the story as a signal through static. And everything about that introduction is everything the character is. Someone who reaches towards strangers, who moves toward people in trouble rather than away, who treats the worst situation as a problem to be solved, rather than a reason to withdraw. He's funnier about it than most people would be. That's the grace note. Not just that he reaches out, but that he does it with a wisecrack, as if the most important thing he can do for this terrified man in a tank is remind him that there are still people in the world who can make a joke. The radio as a motif has a specific resonance in the Walking Dead universe that runs much deeper than this one scene. The Ruth, communication across impossible distance, the attempt to reach someone through static, through walls, through the spaces that danger creates, is one of the show's most persistent images. Rick, in season 3, picks up a phone that isn't connected and hears the voices of people who are dead. The communities in the later seasons are linked by radio networks that are simultaneously their connection to each other and their vulnerability to being found. The CRM uses radio silence as a tool of control. Communication is always fragile in this world, always provisional, always the thing that breaks first and costs the most when it does. Glenn's radio voice. In that tank is the pilot's most hopeful image. Not hopeful in a naive way. Glenn knows the situation is serious, and he's not pretending otherwise. But hopeful in the specific way of someone who hasn't yet decided that reaching towards strangers is a liability. He does it naturally, without calculating the risk. He hears someone in trouble and he reaches. That quality, the reaching, defines Glenn Rhee for the entirety of his time in the show. It defines his relationship with Maggie, which begins as him moving toward her in a dangerous world, and never stops being that. It defines his role in the group, which is never strategic or authoritative, but always relational, always about the specific texture of how he connects to individual people. And it defines his death. In the season 7 premiere, Glenn lunges forward, toward Negan, toward the violence being done to Abraham, because he cannot stop himself from responding to horror with motion, with an attempt to help, with the reaching that has been his defining characteristic from his very first moment in the story. Negan kills him for it. The show, in that moment, takes the quality it introduced through static in a tank in Season 1 and makes it the thing that ends him. It's devastating. It's also, if you look at it with some distance, narratively coherent in the way The Walking Dead is sometimes coherent at its cruelest. Glenn is killed by being Glenn, completely and finally, one last time. Is that why his death hit so hard? The fans who are still talking about it, years later, who cite it as the moment the show lost something essential. I think they're responding to this specific cruelty. Not just that Glenn died, but that what killed him was the thing that made him worth knowing. The reaching. The voice through the radio. The wisecrack in the tank that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. There might be a way out of this." It turns out there wasn't. Not for Glenn. But that first radio transmission, "Hey you, dumbass," remains, for my money, the most complete introduction of a character The Walking Dead ever achieved. And the silence after it, in Season 7, is the pilot's echo finally completing itself. And that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least, it might. There is a horse that dies in The Walking Dead's first episode, and the show doesn't stop for it. Rick finds the horse stabled near a sheriff's station outside Atlanta. The horse is the practical solution to a practical problem. The roads into Atlanta are clogged with abandoned vehicles, impassable by car, but a horse can navigate them. So Rick takes the horse, gently because he grew up around them, and the gentleness is visible in how the scene is filmed, and rides it into the city. It's a beautiful sequence. Man and horse, moving through a landscape that should have been full, and is instead silent. The scale of the city behind them, the quiet of the highway, the animal warmth of a living thing amid all that absence. And then the herd finds them. The walkers surge from between the vehicles. And the horse, which is a horse, an animal operating on fear, not on the kind of cultivated survival instinct that the human characters are still in the process of developing, panics. Rick gets thrown. He crawls under an abandoned vehicle. He escapes eventually into the tank. The horse does not escape. The herd takes it. The sounds of that happening are audible, briefly, before the scene moves on. Rick never mourns the horse. He can't. The herd is still out there. The situation is still critical, and Glenn's voice is coming through the radio. Survival doesn't create space for grief over a horse when human survival is still the open question. So Rick moves on, and the story moves on with him, and the horse becomes a kind of background loss, felt in the moment and then carried forward without being directly addressed. I think the horse is one of the pilot's most quietly important images, precisely because of what the show does and doesn't do with it. The horse is a living thing that helped Rick and paid for it with its life. Its death is not narratively necessary. It's collateral, a consequence of Rick riding into Atlanta on an animal that couldn't understand the risk it was taking. And the show gives it no moment of mourning, because survival in this world doesn't allow for that kind of accounting. Things of beauty and utility get destroyed, and the person who needed them keeps moving, because stopping is the thing that kills you. Every character The Walking Dead later loses without sufficient mourning space is, in this reading, a version of the horse. There are moments across the series where significant deaths are absorbed into the narrative too quickly, where the grief that should be given several episodes is compressed into one, because the plot requires forward motion. The horse in the pilot is the show establishing that pattern before you've had time to object to it. This is how loss works here. You feel it, and you keep moving. You carry the weight without always having the chance to put it down first. What does that do to us as viewers? It does to us, I think, exactly what it does to the characters. It trains us to absorb loss efficiently, to feel and move on, to hold grief in parallel with ongoing investment in the story, rather than in the place where grief traditionally sits, as something that pauses the world while it's processed. The Walking Dead, across its seasons, is one of the only long-running shows that treats its audience's grief capacity as a renewable resource. It takes and takes and takes, and mostly we give it what it asks, because the forward motion keeps us moving too. The horse in the pilot is the first withdrawal from that account, and the show makes it quietly, almost offhandedly, as if it's the most natural thing in the world, which, in the world the pilot is establishing, it is. There's no time to stop. There's a voice on the radio and a way out of the tank, and a group of survivors somewhere beyond the herd, who are going to need what Rick can give them. The horse is gone. Something else will carry him forward. The grieving is for later, and later has a way of never quite arriving. What losses have you never fully been given space to grieve in this show? Drop one in the comments. I have a list, and I suspect it's longer than it should be. The camp outside Atlanta, in the early episodes of Season 1, is a place that The Walking Dead never quite found again, not because no subsequent community was as well written. Alexandria had richer political complexity. The hilltop had more developed community dynamics. The prison had extraordinary tension. But none of them had the specific quality of the camp. A group of people who haven't yet decided what they are to each other, maintaining the forms of ordinary life inside an extraordinary rupture, with the fragility of those forms fully visible in every frame. Carol Pelletier folds laundry in the camp. It's one of the first sustained images we have of her. Careful hands, careful movements. The domestic task performed with the same attention she would have given it before the world ended. She's still inside the habit of it. Around her, other survivors are doing their version of the same thing, maintaining routines that give structure to days that no longer have their old structure. Shane runs perimeter checks. Dale keeps watch from the RV roof. People play cards. People cook. People try to maintain the fiction of normal life at a safe enough distance from what's actually happening that the fiction can hold. And Ed Pelletier makes it difficult to look away from Carol. He's there in those early camp scenes, controlling, contemptuous, the specific architecture of abuse made visible in small gestures, Carol's quietness around him, the way she makes herself smaller, the way she moves through the camp like someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible, because taking up space is dangerous. The pilot and its immediate continuation in episodes 2 and 3 establish Carol's situation with a restraint that's easy to miss on a first watch. No dramatic confrontations yet. No explicit statement of what's happening. Just the texture of a woman who has learned to fold laundry very carefully. What's worth noticing is how much the early camp sequences trust this kind of texture. The micro-routines, the cooking, the watch schedule, the evening gathering, are given space to simply be, without being instrumentalized into plot. Shane's authority in the camp is felt through 100 small interactions before it's ever made explicit. The hierarchy of who speaks and who listens, who takes up space and who gives it, who gets to be afraid out loud and who carries it quietly. All of that is communicated in the way people move around each other during ordinary tasks, in scenes that are about something else on the surface. As the show scaled up, more characters, more action, more plot, more communities to manage, these quiet textures thinned. Not entirely. The Grove in Season 4 has extraordinary textural attention. Clear is almost entirely made of it. But the sustained episode-by-episode quality of the early season, where the drama emerges from the micro-routines rather than being imposed on top of them, became harder to maintain as the show expanded. Part of this is structural. A show with 11 recurring cast members and 3 communities in negotiation with each other simply can't give each character the space that the early camp gave its smaller ensemble. Part of it is tonal. The stakes escalate, the plots require more forward motion, and quiet texture scenes compete with plot-necessary scenes for the limited real estate of each episode. But part of it, and this is my read, clearly labelled as such, is that the early camp benefited from the same condition as the pilot itself. Nobody quite knew yet what the show was going to become. And that uncertainty allowed for a spaciousness that later seasons, with their established formulas and audience expectations, found harder to access. The first season's quietness felt earned. Was it a feature of newness, or a craft decision that required a specific set of conditions to sustain? Both, I suspect. The newness created the space. The craft used it well. And once the newness was gone, the craft had to work harder to find the space elsewhere. Sometimes it succeeded. Sometimes the plot moved too fast for the quiet to settle. And the camp outside Atlanta, with its folded laundry and its evening card games, and its fragile, beautiful performance of normal life, remained what the show kept reaching back toward, even when it couldn't quite get there. Here's the theory I want to lay out, as clearly and carefully as I can, framed as what it is. My reading, grounded in canon, open to other interpretations. The Walking Dead's pilot works the way it works because of a specific structural condition that the show could access only once: the audience, the character, and the world are all encountering the apocalypse simultaneously. Rick doesn't know the rules. We don't know the rules. Fear fills the gap. And into that fear, Darabont places carefully constructed images that land in the body before the mind can categorize them. The little girl, the silence, the pause, the shot. These images work the way they work because they arrive before we have a framework for them. Every subsequent episode of The Walking Dead, every season premiere, every mid-season finale, every carefully constructed sequence that tried to recapture something of that first morning begins with the audience ahead of the experience. We know walkers. We know the rules of survival in this world. We know that communities fall, and that love is dangerous, and that the pause before the shot always has a price. We know it the way the pilot's characters don't know it yet. And that knowledge, that prior framework, changes the fundamental relationship between the image and the viewer. Instead of the image arriving first and understanding following, understanding arrives first, and the image has to push against it to make you feel something. This is not a criticism of the later seasons. It's a structural observation about what's available to a long-running story as it progresses. Every subsequent season premiere attempts to reorient the audience to a new status quo, and each does so competently. Season 2 opens on the highway, the group picking through abandoned vehicles, and the quality of ordinariness around the traffic jam establishes the new baseline efficiently. Season 3 opens on a cleared house, the group moving through it, with the practice coordination of people who have been doing this a long time. And the efficiency of their movement tells you everything about how much has changed. Season 4 opens on the prison garden, Rick with his hands in soil, and the peaceful labor of it tells you, for now, something like rest is possible. These are good choices. They're confident choices, made by skilled storytellers who understood what each season needed to establish at its outset. But they're operating in a mode the pilot never needed to use, the mode of reorientation. The pilot doesn't have to tell you where we are now, because there's no previous now to update. The pilot has the rarest available position in long-form storytelling, the position of first encounter. And Darabont used it with a discipline that produced something structurally unrepeatable. The show's emotional ceiling shifts after the pilot, not because the storytelling gets worse, but because the relationship between image and viewer changes fundamentally. We are no longer discovering alongside Rick. We are ahead of him or beside him, but never behind. And the specific electricity of that behind position, of looking at an image and not yet knowing what it means, of feeling something before understanding it, belongs entirely to the pilot and to whatever moments the later seasons could create. Briefly, when they found ways to put the viewer somewhere unknown again. Clear does it in a limited way, by making the familiar strange through Morgan's grief. The Grove does it by building a situation so specific and so morally impossible that no prior experience of the show prepares you for it. If the first episode's power was built on not knowing, could the franchise ever manufacture that feeling again? Some fans believe Fear the Walking Dead's first season came closest, and we'll look at that carefully in the next chapter. Others argue that no sequel, spin-off, or continuation can ever fully recreate the condition of encountering a world for the very first time, because the first time is irreversible by definition. Both readings are legitimate. Both point to the same honest acknowledgement. The pilot is, in this specific structural sense, alone. It stands at the beginning of something rather than in the middle of it, and that position belongs to it permanently. The rest is echo. Long, rich, occasionally extraordinary echo. The echo nonetheless. Fear the Walking Dead was announced, in the lead-up to its 2015 premiere, as the Walking Dead spin-off that would show what the main show couldn't. The actual beginning. The outbreak itself. The world not yet ended, but actively ending. The before giving way to the after in real time, in front of characters who still have their old lives close enough to touch. The premise was, in my read, explicitly an attempt to find the pilot's condition again. The discovery mode, the first encounter, the experience of seeing the apocalypse before the rules of surviving it were established. Fear's first season is, by significant distance, the spin-off's most critically recognized. And I think the reason is exactly what the premise promised. For a few episodes, the characters are where Rick was in the pilot. They're inside the confusion of something they don't have frameworks for yet. A son who seems sick, but isn't sick in any way the mother understands. Behavior that doesn't fit any category she knows. The specific horror of watching something familiar becomes something else, while you're still trying to treat it as familiar. Madison Clark watching her world change incrementally, and trying to apply the tools she has. Therapy, communication, family intervention, to a situation that those tools can't reach. The pilot's silence before the shot, in Fear's early episodes, is stretched across episodes rather than seconds, and it works. The further Fear moved from its first season, as it expanded, time jumped, changed its cast and its setting and its tone repeatedly across subsequent seasons, the further it moved from that original condition. Which makes sense. You can only encounter the apocalypse for the first time once. Fear's first season used its version of first encounter well. Then the show had to figure out what it was doing next. Some seasons found good answers to that question. Others found less satisfying ones. But the peak of what Fear achieved, what made it feel like it was doing something the main show couldn't do anymore, was always that original condition of shared unknowing. There's a moment in Fear the Walking Dead's early episodes. I want to be careful here, and flag this clearly as my observation. rather than quoting specific dialogue I might misattribute, where Travis Manawa understands fully and finally what the world has become and what that understanding requires of him. The silence in that moment has the quality of Morgan's window, the terrible space between knowing and acting, the pause before the shot, the gap that the pilot opened, and the franchise keeps returning to. It's the show's original wound, migrating into a new body. World Beyond took a different approach. If Fear tried to find the pilot by going earlier in time, World Beyond tried to find it by going further, centering characters who were children when the apocalypse began, who grew up inside the after without the before as a reference point. The theory, which makes narrative sense, was that a generation without the old world's frameworks might encounter their own version of first discovery, might have their own unknowing to fill with the specific electricity of the pilot. World Beyond is the franchise's most explicit attempt to ask, what does first encounter look like for people who never had the before? The results are more mixed, and the show didn't run long enough to fully develop its premise. But the attempt is instructive. The franchise keeps returning to the beginning, to day one, to the first walker, to the first impossible choice, as if there's something there that later stories need and can't generate from scratch. The pilot has a quality that functions almost like a source, something that gives later stories their material, even as those stories can't replicate the conditions that produced it. Is the franchise looking for something it knows it lost? I think that's the most honest framing of what the spin-offs are doing when they return to beginnings and origins and the specific texture of first encounter. Not admitting failure. The universe has produced genuinely excellent work in the years since the pilot, but acknowledging, quietly and through the structure of its choices, that there was something in days gone by that everything afterward has been in relationship with. Something unrepeatable that the franchise keeps trying to find again anyway. Because the alternative is accepting that the first morning was also, in some essential way, the best one. Let's go back to Morgan's window one more time, because I think, if we look at it carefully, at the specific shape of what that image means across the full arc of Morgan Jones's story in the franchise, tells us something about the pilot that goes beyond craft or structure, or even the condition of first encounter. Morgan can't fire in season 1. His wife, Jenny, walks below the window. His son, Dwayne, is in the room with him. The rifle is in his hands, and he cannot close the distance between his knowledge and his action, because the love he has for the woman below the window, the before love, the love that belongs to who they were together before any of this, is still stronger than the understanding that what's walking below the window isn't her anymore. He knows. He also loves. And the two things cannot coexist in a way that allows him to act. In Clear, in season 3, we find out what happened. Morgan did eventually go back. He did eventually fire. And by then, it was too late. Dwayne was already gone, bitten by Jenny, the very person Morgan couldn't end. The hesitation didn't save her. It just changed the shape of the loss. The love that made him pause ultimately cost him everything the love was trying to protect. This is the pilot's thesis, stated in the clearest possible terms across the fullest possible arc. Love creates the pause creates the wound, and the wound doesn't go away when you finally act. It just becomes a different wound. Morgan's story across the franchise. Season 1, Season 3's Clear. His return in Seasons 5 and 6. His presence in Season 7. And transition into Fear the Walking Dead. Is the pilot's original question extended across a decade of storytelling? What do you do when love and survival require opposite things? When the most human thing you have is the most dangerous thing you carry? Every major character in The Walking Dead inherits some version of this question. Rick and Shane. Rick loves Carl and Laurie enough to try to hold on to the old frameworks, long after the frameworks have stopped working. Shane loves Rick, loved him, in the specific way of long friendship. And that love is what makes his betrayal feel like grief rather than villainy. The hesitation in their relationship, the long delay before the inevitable, is Morgan's window at a different scale. Carol and Sophia. Carol's pause, her inability in season 2 to act decisively on what she may have suspected about Sophia's fate, is the window again. She loved her daughter in a world that punishes that love by letting the loved thing become something else, while you wait for a way to protect it that doesn't require the hardest choice. Maggie and the war. Maggie loves Glenn so completely that his death could have made her into something consumed by that love. By grief. By vengeance. By the refusing to act that Morgan's love modeled. Instead, she builds. She leads. She eventually works alongside the man who killed Glenn, not because she's forgiven the wound, but because the alternative is letting the wound make all her decisions. Her arc is Morgan's window seen from the other side, a person who found a way to act. Eventually, even though the love never stopped making it hard. What would The Walking Dead look like if someone, somewhere, had fired in time? This is a question without a clean answer. And I want to be honest about that. If Morgan had fired in season 1, had closed the gap between knowing and doing before the hesitation cost him Dwayne, we wouldn't have clear. We might not have Morgan's return. The specific painful arc that Lenny James has played across the franchise might not exist. The wound would have been different, not absent. Because in this world, as the pilot makes clear from its very first sequence, the shot and the pause both have a price. The question isn't whether you'll pay, it's which currency the cost arrives in. And Morgan's window teaches us, gently and over years, that the price of love in this world doesn't go down just because you eventually act. It just stops accumulating the specific interest that hesitation charges. The pilot embedded all of this in one window, in one man with a rifle, in one absence of a shot. There are episodes in The Walking Dead's 11-season run that feel, watching them, like the show finding its way back to the pilot's standard. Not many, but a few. And the pattern of which ones they are tells us something important about what the pilot built, that later seasons could only approach in concentrated bursts. Clear, in season 3, is the most complete. Rick, Michonne, and Carl drive back to Rick's hometown, ostensibly for weapons, actually for something Rick needs that he can't name, and find Morgan, alone, in a town he has fortified with traps and written over with the words of a man who has been living in his own damage for too long. The episode's power comes from its containment. 3 characters, a small location, a conversation between 2 men who started at the same place and went different directions, and the specific weight of everything that diverged between them. The pilot's conditions are recreated, partially, small cast, contained space, moral weight that can't be resolved through action. The episode can't recreate the condition of first encounter. We know the world by season 3. We know Rick. We know what Morgan was at the beginning. But it recreates the quiet, the pace of the pilot, patient, unhurried, willing to let a face be a face for longer than efficient storytelling requires, is there in clear, in a way it isn't in most of the episodes around it. The Grove, in season 4, is the other high-water mark that most fans and critics point to. It's an episode that takes the pilot's central question. What do you do when love and survival require opposite things? And states it in its most extreme form. Carol, Tyrese, Lizzie, Mika, and Judith, alone in a cottage. No action to resolve the situation, only the impossible choice. The episode is devastating precisely because it's quiet. Small space, small cast, enormous moral weight, and the willingness to let the silence before the shot stretch until the viewer fully understands what it means. JSS in Season 6 is a different kind of candidate, not slow and contained, but constructed with the same visual intentionality that Darabont brought to the pilot. Carol's sequence during the wolf attack on Alexandria is, in this reading, a direct echo of Rick's tank sequence. A person alone in a dangerous environment, thinking faster than fear. Doing what survival requires while some part of them watches it happen. Carol in Season 6 is Rick in Season 1, except that she's had years to practice not hesitating, and the confidence of that practice is both impressive and quietly terrible. What the pattern of these episodes suggests, and this is my read, not a statement about creator intention, is that the pilot's standard was achievable, not consistently, not as a baseline, but in concentrated episodes under specific conditions. Limited cast, contained space, moral weight too heavy for action to carry, and the discipline to let silence be silence, rather than filling it with movement. The show could reach the pilot when it stripped back to the pilot's conditions. Does that confirm the standard was achievable but not sustainable? Or does it confirm something slightly different? That the show could only reach that standard in isolated bursts, because the long-form demands of an 11-season run required a mode of storytelling that couldn't maintain the pilot's specific discipline continuously? I think probably the second. Not because the talent wasn't there, but because the conditions that make the pilot's standard possible. The small cast, the contained space, the full room for silence are in tension with the demands of sustaining audience investment across hundreds of hours of television. The show needed more characters, more plot, more communities, more conflict. And more of those things meant less of the specific quiet the pilot built its power from. If you had to pick one episode after the pilot that came closest, I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments. For mine, I keep coming back to Clear. Not because it's the most emotional episode the show made, though it's one of them, but because it's the one that most purely recreates the condition of being alone with something too large to hold, and having no choice but to hold it anyway. Which is, I think, what the pilot was always about. Let's go back to the gas station. Rick, crouching, pink bunny slippers. The pause. Here's what that image looks like now, carrying everything we've walked through tonight. The pilot, Morgan's window, Glenn's voice through static, the horse, the camp, the spin-off searching for a first morning they couldn't find, the episodes that came closest in isolated bursts, under the right conditions, when the show stripped back to silence and let the silence do the work. The pause before the shot is not a moment of weakness. I want to be clear about that because it's easy to read it that way. Rick, the trained law enforcement officer, hesitating in front of a threat. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is the last moment of the old world, existing inside a person. Rick is still wearing his uniform. He still believes, in some part of himself that hasn't caught up to the evidence yet, that there are rules for this. That the rules he knows apply here. That the badge in his pocket means something that the badge in his pocket can't mean anymore. The pause is his old self, making its last argument. And then he fires, and the argument is over. The shot ends the before. In Rick Grimes. The pause was the before, held for one breath, for as long as the love for who he was could keep the knowledge of who he'd have to be at bay. That's the whole show. Not the walkers, not the wars, not the communities, and their falls, and their foundings. The whole show is the pause and the shot, enacted again and again, in every character who has to become something the before version of themselves would not have recognized. Morgan at the window. Glenn on the radio reaching toward a stranger, because that's who he is and always will be, right up until it kills him. Carol. Folding laundry in the camp, still inside the before shape of who she was, years away from the person she'll have to become to survive. Rick on horseback, riding into a city that used to be full of people, wearing his uniform because the uniform is all that's left of the framework that used to tell him who he was. The pilot was not trying to be topped. I don't think Darabont sat down to make the definitive statement of what The Walking Dead was about and then handed it over for 11 seasons of footnotes. But the pilot is, in retrospect, the most complete and concentrated version of the question the show kept asking across its entire run. Because it had the one condition no later episode could recover. The question was genuinely open. The world was genuinely new. The rules were genuinely unknown. And in that genuine unknowing, images could arrive before frameworks, and feeling could happen before understanding, and a pair of pink bunny slippers could carry the full weight of what civilization meant, and what it had lost. The franchise has been chasing that feeling since the morning of October 31st, 2010, when the first episode aired, and changed quietly and permanently. What people expected from television about survival and found family, and the cost of love. The spin-offs are chasing it. The standalone films, when they arrive, will probably chase it too. Not because any of them are admitting failure. The universe has produced genuinely beautiful work in the years since the pilot. But because the pilot is the origin. It's the first morning. And first mornings have a specific gravity that everything subsequent orbits around, whether it means to or not. The pause before the shot. Rick at the gas station, seeing what he's looking at, knowing what it means, not yet having the framework to act on the knowing. That's where The Walking Dead began. That's where it's always, in some essential way, still located. In the space between what we know and what we can bring ourselves to do with what we know. Maybe the pilot was never meant to be topped. Maybe it was meant to be the thing every episode afterward was reaching back toward. The original grief, the original mourning, the original choice. The silence before the first shot. The pause that held the whole old world in one breath before it let it go. If The Walking Dead's first episode was the show at its truest, what does it mean that we kept watching for 11 more seasons, hoping to feel that way again? I think it means we understood, somewhere beneath the watching, that you can't go back to the first morning. You can only carry it forward. And that carrying, the weight of it, the love of it, the grief of it, is what the whole long journey was always really about. If you watched till the end, thank you for staying through this whole journey. It shows you really are a die-hard Walking Dead fan. Please consider liking and subscribing if you want to show a way of support. It means a lot. Thank you, and take care.